Welcome to A Voice for Creators. I'm your host, Daniel Norton. Today we're going to talk a little bit about change. And before we do that, though, I have another review. So I've been falling behind on reading these. If you guys leave me a 5-star review, I will read it eventually. So let's get to this one. Okay, the Thinking Person's Podcast, 5 stars. I love this podcast. I love not having to listen to normal claptrap of gear and settings. Daniel makes me think. Whiskey Turner via Apple Podcasts Australia. Thank you so much. Yeah, this makes me think too. This is one reason why I do it. It's a way for me to just kind of talk out loud and get my thoughts out into the world, and hopefully they connect with people. So thanks so much for leaving a review, and thanks everyone for listening. So let's talk about change. I think we're going to see a couple of different, coming up in the next few weeks, we're going to see some Billy Joel references here, because I've been listening to a lot of Billy Joel, the musician. I don't know if there was another Billy Joel that somebody would just say Billy Joel. But anyways, and I was listening to the song. I was driving along and I heard the song Down East Alexa. And that was my Massachusetts accent coming out there. And it's about, if you don't know the song, it's basically about a fisherman in Long Island or, off Long Island. And, it's all about the struggles. And what's interesting is there's a line in it where he says, "There ain't no island left for islanders like me." And he's talking about the idea that change has happened, right? What used to be there, what his father did, what had been generational work is changing, for various reasons, And this is really relevant to us in the arts because this is a constant change. And one of the things that's happening now, of course, that we're seeing a lot is AI. I'm not going to get a lot into that because I don't have a lot of knowledge in it, so it's not something I can really speak on. I think that it's going to be interesting as we've noticed, like recently, Adobe has released an AI thingy, and I think we're going to notice where they're going to, and my understanding is Adobe's is using their stock as the feed for it, so it's not just taking random stuff, which is part of the problem some people have with AI. Again, I'm not an expert in this. If you have something to say about it, please do call in and we'll talk about it. But anyways, what we're seeing is when people defend these things, they talk about the idea that, when you're using Photoshop and you take out a background and it replaces it with something else automatically, that's AI, which is true, right? On some level, I guess. I don't know. Maybe it's not as defined, but basically tools that make the job easier. And at some point, maybe, right, we will lose the art that goes into it. That's maybe the fear. I remember, I'm just going to roll back pretty far. So I'm going to kind of give you a little history of my time in the industry and how things have changed and where we are now, and talk a little bit about how I have adapted or plan on adapting. And maybe you can get something from this, or like I said, let me know how you're dealing with it. So when I very first started in photography, obviously, well, maybe not obviously, it was professionally, it was the late 1990s. And obviously, now I'll say obviously, digital was not a thing. It was, but it wasn't. I think the original news cameras, the Kodaks that were super expensive, might have existed, but they weren't at all feasible for most people to have. So I started off shooting film, and I remember when I first started that the photographers I was working for, the younger photographers, were talking about all this new slide film that was really good because you could go up to like 200 ISO, and it made life easier, and it was just better to deal with. And older photographers would be like, "Oh man, these new photographers, they don't know how to shoot. We used to use Kodachrome 25. So already there was this, right? Like Kodachrome is a very difficult film to shoot. It's beautiful, but you got to nail it, right? And already there was this thing, right? And then as I started to shoot, there was a shift, especially in fashion, towards using print film, so negative film. And negative film compared to slide film is, oh my God, so much easier to shoot. So much more, well, it's called dynamic range to kind of use modern terms, but so much more range. You can screw it up basically and still be able to get something out of it a lot of times. It's easier, it's cheaper, it's faster. So what we found was people, once again, complaining and saying, what is going on here? It's like now just anybody can be a photographer because they can, which I think is hilarious. And right around that same time, small digital cameras started to become more and more common. And I remember that I was friends with, I had originally worked for, and then we later shared a studio, but at that point we were just kind of friends, a photographer who a lot of their job was shooting mock-ups for advertising agencies. They didn't really usually use him because he was a younger guy for the ad, right? But if like Coca-Cola, if they were pitching to Coca-Cola to do this certain ad layout, they would draw it. And then the next step as they got closer is they would actually have him do, a very basic version of it with product. He was a product photographer. He'd put the Coke in the ice and do the thing, and do, really basic stuff, not 100% what the ad would be, but similar. And that was how he made his money. He would do they didn't pay a lot, obviously because it wasn't the big ad, but he shot almost every day. He was constantly shooting these little projects. And one day he just told me, he's like, one of the bigger agencies he's worked for, he's like, they bought a digital camera. Like literally, I think one of those Macavia ones that you put a disc in the side. And because of that, and just using, because again, this is just basically for layout. And because they could use Photoshop, they basically stopped using him for at least half of his work, immediately just cut. And he had to rethink what he was doing. He had sold himself as this person that did a very specific thing. He shot this kind of work, which wasn't super high paying. I mean, it was higher paying than magazine work, but it wasn't advertising work. And every advertising agency knew him as the mock-up guy. They weren't hiring for the ads, but now the mock-ups were going away. So what does he do? And he shifted and changed and tried to get more advertising work, went to agencies he didn't normally work for. And again, but basically technology or times changed and put him in a position where he had to change. It literally ripped from him the job, right? Now, did it take away the big advertising job? No. Did it take away the job from the advertising agencies for doing the project? No. It took away that one segment of the thing that was his specific job. And if you specialize, and I've talked about this before, that you should specialize, but if you over-specialize, you can find yourself caught. And this is why when we're building our business, I've talked about this before, you don't want to just have one client. And this way, while he had a lot of clients, he had one thing, right? He did the one thing, and that's all he did. So being a product photographer is specializing. Being a product photographer that only shoots mock-ups for these advertising agencies is probably over-specializing. Moving forward, digital came, and funny enough, the early stages of digital, I was an early adopter when Canon first came out with their affordable, I think it was $4,000 or $5,000 digital cameras, 3 megapixels or something. I bought it because I made a decision that I was going to try to go with the technology, and it was fine. And I used it, almost never used it on actual work, which is funny. I used it for model testing, which I guess I was getting paid for, but any advertising jobs, whatever I got, people still weren't shooting digital unless digital backs existed, but again, they were more rare. And so you were still shooting film for that. Slide film. When we eventually transition over to digital, though, again, you reach this point where now things become, and I've talked about this before, I have a great friend who was a stylist, then a makeup artist, then an art director, and now a photographer. And when she was learning, it didn't take her long to do really well. And the reason why, and we've talked about this kind of stuff before, is because she was already involved in it. She already had the eye. She already knew the sets. She just didn't know the lighting. And the lighting is just something you can learn, right? Will she ever be a nuanced, great, perfect lighting person? That maybe if she wants to be, but did she need to be? No, not really, because in most commercial lighting, it's not that complicated. That's just the reality of it, right? But anyways, she was able to do that. Now, this is the kind of thing where people are taking our jobs. But the reality is that she was already an artist, already in the field. Technology is making it easier. Technology is changing what we do. No longer are you the guy. I remember I was just having this conversation with a friend of mine. The first time it sticks in my head, the first time I was shooting digital with a digital back, it wasn't the first time I was shooting with a digital back, but the first time I was shooting with a digital back, and this happened. And I was working on a fashion catalog, and I'm shooting the model, and then the client, I hear them from behind me. They say, "You got it." Now, as somebody maybe new or somebody who hasn't worked as a commercial photographer, you might be like, "Why is that a weird thing?" Well, coming from film, or even before that, when we first switched digital, that was your decision, right? You were the photographer. It's part of the trust the client has in you that you got the shot. Like, I sit there and I shoot the model until I get it, then I go, okay, we got it. And the client trusts that I got it. Now it's changed. Now they can stand there and go, that's the shot I like. This is both great because they got a shot they love before you walk off the set, and maybe bad in a sense because now, the photographer doesn't have to be as on, because if they're not getting the shot, the client can see they're not getting the shot, and changes can be made on the set. Things shift. Things, the kind of the middle ground starts to shift and things become easier. Does that mean that it's the job goes away? Not necessarily. It just means that, especially in the arts, that we have to be more creative in how we work. So when we look at things and we say, okay, we'll just go back to AI for a second. Somebody can jump into an AI in theory. I don't know all the licensing and stuff, so this is, again, just putting it out there. And they can say, well, okay, I want a mock-up of, we're going to go all the way back to my friend, a can of Coke in some ice sitting on, a porch or whatever with trees in the background. And it can make that for them. Okay, right? That now removes, in a different way, the job that he had. But if that's your job, right, to just do those mock-ups, that's a major change. And you've kind of put yourself in a box. And I think you want to be careful with that. If you bring something to it, if you bring your personality, your eye, your certain kind of style, right, to a shoot, that can't just be replicated by somebody saying can of Coke in ice on the porch, right? So things need to change, things need to adjust. I think we're going to see moving forward, this is my prediction, more kind of individually created projects where people are hired to do very specific things in their own way, as opposed to here's a thing, just replicate this. Because I think that is going to become, air quoting here, easier, so they won't want to pay a lot for it. So this is where I think things are going. I think in a way it's liberating and great, because it's going to be, hey, Daniel, we want to do this project. Here's a budget. Here's a thing. Go do something. And you're going to get fewer of those projects, but they're going to be your passion. You're going to be able to do what you want. They're hiring you because they love your style. The stuff where you're just shooting something, it might slowly but surely start to go away. Now, that being said, this can't happen with, well, I say it can't, but it will be less likely to happen with things that are unique products like fashion, right? Obviously, every year, fashion has to be shot because you can't just use the same can of Coke, right? So anyways, that's what I'm thinking here. And that got me thinking. And this is one of those areas too, where it goes to show you where inspiration comes from. It goes to show you where inspiration comes from. I'm driving along in my car, I hear a song and I think, I can relate to that. And that means that that song is art, if you didn't already think that. And when somebody looks at one of your images or reads something that you've written or something that looks at it, something you've drawn or whatever you do for your art, and is inspired by it, that's powerful. So I hope this inspires you. See a little segue, I tried to do that. And let me know. Again, check the show notes. There's a way to call into the Spotify for podcasters, I think it's called now. There's a link right there, but better probably is to just join the Discord. There's a link to that down there too. If you want your voice on the show, you can just record a message and send it to me as a private message. If you just want to send me a message, I can read it and then talk about it a little bit here. And finally, you'll see a link to my Patreon if you'd like to support the podcast. Check that out as well. I'll talk to you soon.